I created an overworld with NPCs, shop mechanics, new guns, and new playable characters. And then I asked you a very vague question. What particles, effects, or thing would make my game more appealing? And despite the vague question, I actually got some really good feedback. The first thing I did was add some basic lighting and a vignette, which made a world of difference. Like, it's silly how much of an effect this had. It's just some shading on the edges of the screen, but it makes the game look so much better. But speaking of the comments, one of the most common things that was commented about was the fact that the enemies kind of go poof. There's no death animation, they just disappear. But I didn't want to go and make a death animation for every single kind of enemy because that would be a lot of frames. So I went looking for a better way. And I found it. In, again, Revita. When enemies die in Revita, there is no death animation. Instead, there's a death effect. And this effect is used for basically every enemy in the game, which is extremely economical. Because if you had to draw death animation frames for every single enemy in the game, it quickly adds up to be just a mountain of work. And after searching some more, I found out that this is actually a pretty common trick. Like in Brotato, for example, enemies spawn in with a spawn animation that's basically the same for every enemy. And while Revita does a really good job of making the best use of as few frames as possible, Brotato basically just has a single image for most enemies, and then manipulates that with squash and stretch rather than drawing new animation frames, which is such a great idea. Because if you've ever worked on a game before, you know that the art is actually one of the most time-consuming parts of development. Making a game with triangles and circles is pretty easy. But then animating everything is where it becomes a real pain. So, for my own game, I didn't need to worry about spawn animations because they spawn off-screen. But I did take the trick from Revita and made a very basic death particle thing. And then so that I could use the same one for every kind of enemy, I made the size of the effect change based on the width of the enemy that dies. And I think this is okay for now, but I might change it out later. Thankfully though, this all happens with a single event, so if I just change the one image file, it'll change for all of the enemies, which is great because it's a huge time saver. And then in the comments, somebody mentioned foreground elements, like you would see in a lot of platformer games. And it was hard to find examples of that for top-down games, but I get what they meant. So I did try originally for spiderwebs and kind of ropes and things and try to put that in, and I kind of got it working, but it never ever felt right. So then I tried to do it with wood supports. Wooden supports that you would see holding up the floor above you. Try to make it so that you could look down through those or something, but I felt that this was really just obscuring the game, and it didn't seem to be adding enough to justify it. But I still like the idea of a foreground element, something that your character could go under, and it would have different shading than other places. So I ended up taking the vignette layer and adding some shadows to it. Shadows that would imply vines or ropes or something like that above you that would be casting a shadow. And then I set it to randomize so that every room you go into will have a different vignette. And I think that looked okay. And there were a lot of comments on the floor being a very blank, boring looking thing. And even though I know that this isn't pixel art, and a lot of pixel artists would get really mad at me for this, as a really basic way to give the floor texture, I just took this rock image, layered it over the floor, and changed its opacity down to the point where you could barely see it, so the floor would have some variety. It doesn't look great, but I think it's better than a blank floor. Maybe it'll get changed in the future, but for now it does the trick. And the next thing I wanted to do was add some overgrowth, so it looks like it's a more lived-in old space, rather than the current pristine walls that are perfect. So for this I just created some green overlay for different sections of the wall, and then a couple little patches here and there for some discoloration in the floor. And then just like the vignettes, I randomized it so you get different ones for different rooms. And while I really liked the way this looked, it created a weird contrast because the walls were still perfect. They just had things growing on them. So I went back into those growth layers and added some chipping and broken blocks and things like that to give it a little more of a broken down look. And I know that a lot of the people in the comments asked for more objects in the room to actually interact with, like tables and breakable pots and things like that. But just this bit of variety in how the room looks, I think is a big improvement. And I will definitely make those breakable pots and tables and things later down the road. And then I applied these layers to the overworld where I remembered that one of the comments asked for a crackling fireplace sound. And I didn't feel like subjecting my microphone to an actual fire, so I went to Open Game Art and found a crackling fireplace sound effect, and put that into the game with a range on it so you only hear it when you're close enough to the fire. And then I grabbed some music from my favorite musician, with light in their name, and I picked something quiet and sort of soothing because the overworld is going to be your break from all of the action that's happening in the game. So I wanted to keep that space relatively quiet and calm, to let you recharge and get ready for the next run. And the next thing I wanted was a transition into the dungeon, because some people pointed out that when you click on the door, you just immediately go into the dungeon, and it's kind of jarring. So I took the door image into aseprite and made the door slide open when you click on it. And just don't look at the door handles, okay? The door is totally supposed to slide open, promise. And then I added some particle effects for dust down at the bottom, and added some screen shake and a sound effect as it opens up. And that looks like this. I added a fading in and out transition, and then I spent some time going around and tweaking the pitch and sound effect for different things, like when the coin comes up, or when you shoot, or when enemies die, and so on. Now the next thing I want to do is send off the game for some playtesting, to see if they can catch some major bugs or issues or annoyances that would get in a player's way, which means that I had to get the game playtest ready. I had to tie up some loose ends and check for any obvious bugs that would get in the way. And a big and consistent bug that I've kind of been hiding was the fact that the pickup objects, both the health and the point object, were causing a lot of lag, and I had no idea why. I could fill the entire room with a bunch of enemies that were animated and attacking me and doing a whole bunch of different things, and I wouldn't see any frames dropping at all. But throw a handful of these objects into the game, which is what would happen when you kill a boss, and suddenly I'm losing frames. Which is kind of a big deal, because I'm running this game on a pretty good laptop, and I want the game to be playable by everybody. So after isolating just the object to see whether it was the events or rendering it on screen that were causing the issue, I found out it was the rendering and not the events, which meant that there was something about spawning these little pixels that was more intense than spawning a bunch of enemies. And after trying to change the image and mess around with it some more, I noticed this. I had left a pretty heavy bloom effect on the object, but it had no padding, so the bloom wasn't reaching beyond the sprite, so I couldn't see it and I had no idea. This must have been something that I set up very early on in an attempt to make 4 pixels look good somehow, and after removing that effect, it worked great. And I used that as an opportunity to also make the image a little more interesting. So now the point objects and the health objects have a little flash animation that plays, and they blink just before despawning. But while that part of the video is playing, I need you to do me a favor. Could you comment down below and tell me what you think of early access? Because that's essentially what this is going to be, is an early access release, people getting the game before it's finished. So let me know what you think of that. Will people that are playtesting the game not be able to enjoy the final experience? And should I do that for the game itself? Put out a proper early access release, or hold off until I'm confident that the game is as good as it can be? I think there's pros and cons to both, but let me know what you think in the comments. A huge thank you to my patrons. Because of them, my coffee cup is full. And as always, the links to the places that I hang out are down below, and if you decide to click on one, then I'll see you there.